Sometimes the loudest act of disrespect isn't an insult. It's the silence that tells someone they don't belong. The lunch crowd filled every corner of Carter's Grill with the comforting sounds of ordinary life. Plates clinked against polished wooden tables. Conversations overlapped into a warm hum. Fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of grilled steak and buttered rolls. It was the kind of neighborhood restaurant where strangers often shared tables during busy afternoons. Except on that day. Master Sergeant Elijah Carter, retired after nearly 3 decades of military service, stepped quietly through the front door wearing a neatly pressed but well-worn brown jacket. His silver hair framed a weathered face that carried countless untold stories. A faded veteran's cap rested gently in his hands before he placed it back onto his head with quiet dignity. He wasn't dressed like someone important. He carried no medals. No ribbons decorated his jacket. Nothing announced the years he had spent serving his country. To everyone else, he looked like an elderly black man who had simply wandered in alone. Emily Brooks looked up from behind the counter. She greeted every customer with the same smile, but something about Elijah immediately caught her attention. Perhaps it was the calm in his eyes, or perhaps it was the careful way he paused to let a young mother and her children enter before him, despite arriving first. "Good afternoon, sir," she said warmly. Elijah smiled. "Afternoon, ma'am." His voice was soft, steady, and carried the unmistakable politeness of someone raised to believe respect should never depend on who stood in front of you. Emily glanced around the crowded dining room. "I'm afraid we're almost completely full." Elijah nodded without disappointment. "I don't mind waiting." Before she could answer, a small table near the center of the restaurant became available. Emily picked up a menu. "I have 1 table now." She led him across the room. As Elijah approached, something subtle began happening. A businessman gathering his laptop looked toward Elijah for only a second before quietly moving to another empty seat farther away. A young couple exchanged brief glances. Without saying a word, they collected their drinks and asked another server if another table had opened. An older man folded his newspaper, stood, and walked toward the opposite side of the dining room. No one raised their voice. Old veterans capped the moment Elijah removed it to take a sip of coffee. He studied the worn embroidery for a second, as though trying to remember where he had seen that insignia before. Before he could stand, the low rumble of powerful engine. Turner stood so quickly that his chair scraped across the wooden floor. "That's General Anderson," he whispered, almost under his breath. The words spread across the room faster than anyone expected. "A 4-star general. Here, at Carter's Grill." Linda hurried outside with a welcoming smile. "General Anderson, what an incredible honor. We're delighted to have you." He acknowledged her with a polite nod, but never slowed his pace. His eyes had already settled on someone inside the restaurant. He walked past the manager, past the local businessman eager to introduce himself, past several retired officers who instinctively stood as he entered. He ignored every outstretched hand, every greeting, every attempt to gain his attention. His destination had been decided before he stepped through the door. Emily noticed it first. His eyes never wandered. They remained fixed on the elderly black veteran, quietly drinking coffee alone. Elijah looked up as the restaurant grew strangely silent. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. General Anderson's expression softened in a way few people had ever witnessed during public appearances. It was not the look of a superior approaching a subordinate. It was the look of someone seeing a person he deeply respected. Jason frowned. "Does he know him?" Nobody answered. The general continued walking until he reached the small table near the center of the room. Elijah slowly set his coffee cup onto its saucer. A faint smile crossed his weathered face, as though he recognized the footsteps before seeing the man. "Good afternoon, sir," Elijah said quietly. The general stopped beside the table. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. Without saying a single word, he removed his service cap and held it carefully beneath one arm. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. No one understood what was about to happen. Not the customers, not the staff, not even Michael Turner, who had spent years learning military customs. General Anderson took one deliberate step backward. His polished shoes came together with quiet precision. Then, with flawless discipline and unmistakable respect, he raised his right hand toward the brim of his forehead. The salute was perfect, not ceremonial, not casual, personal. The room froze. Every eye remained fixed on the impossible sight unfolding before them. A four-star general was saluting the quiet old black veteran whom everyone else had chosen to leave sitting alone. The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity. No one in Carter's grill moved. No one spoke. General William Anderson held his salute with absolute precision, his posture unwavering, his expression filled not with authority, but with gratitude. The elderly man before him slowly rose from his chair. Master Sergeant Elijah Carter stood carefully, one hand resting briefly on the edge of the table before straightening his back. Though age had added weight to his shoulders, something changed the moment he faced the general. Years of military discipline quietly returned. His movements were measured, deliberate, instinctive. He reached for the faded veteran's cap resting beside his coffee, placed it gently on his head, and looked directly into the general's eyes. For a brief moment, neither man needed words. Then Elijah returned the salute, not as an old man, not as someone seeking recognition, but as a soldier answering another soldier. The restaurant seemed to disappear around them. Several veterans seated across the room instinctively stood. Michael Turner felt a lump rise in his throat. During his years in the Marines, he had witnessed countless formal ceremonies, promotion boards, and military funerals. Yet none of them carried the quiet emotional weight of what he was seeing now. Jason Miller stared in disbelief. He glanced from the general to the elderly black veteran and back again. This doesn't make any sense, he whispered. Emily remained frozen beside the coffee station, one hand still holding the empty pot she had intended to refill. Only minutes earlier, she had watched customers avoid Elijah's table as though his presence made them uncomfortable. Now the highest-ranking officer many of them had ever seen was standing before that very same man with unmistakable reverence. Only after several long seconds did General Anderson slowly lower his hand. "So good to see you." Again, Sergeant Carter. Elijah smiled, the corners of his weathered face softening. "It's been a long time, General. Far too long." The general extended both hands instead of one. Elijah accepted them warmly. It was not the handshake of strangers. It was the greeting of men who had shared experiences that few people could ever understand. Linda Cooper stepped closer, her voice almost hesitant. "General, forgive me for asking, but how do you know Mr. Carter?" General Anderson turned toward the room. His eyes moved slowly across the faces that had been watching in stunned silence. Some looked curious. Others looked embarrassed. A few quietly lowered their eyes. "I know him," the general said calmly, "because before I ever wore these 4 stars, before I commanded soldiers around the world, before anyone called me general, I served under Master Sergeant Elijah Carter." The words landed like thunder. Michael's eyes widened. Jason's confident expression disappeared completely. Emily covered her mouth with one trembling hand. General Anderson continued, "There are officers who teach strategy. There are leaders who teach discipline. And then there are rare people who teach you what courage actually looks like." He turned back toward Elijah. "I learned that from him." Elijah gave a small shake of his head, almost uncomfortable with the attention. "We all did our jobs." The general smiled. "No, Sergeant, you did far more than that." Around the restaurant, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Only minutes earlier, people had silently avoided sharing a table with the quiet old black veteran. Now every person in the room wished they had been the one sitting beside him. The greatest heroes rarely begin their stories by talking about themselves. Usually, someone whose life was changed tells it for them. General Anderson looked around the restaurant one more time before speaking again. "You all deserve to know why I saluted this man." Every eye followed him. Even the cooks had quietly stepped out of the kitchen. The only sound left in Carter's grill was the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The general rested one hand lightly on the back of Elijah's chair. 32 years ago, he began, I was a young lieutenant leading a reconnaissance unit overseas. He smiled faintly. I thought graduating near the top of my class meant I was prepared for anything. Elijah chuckled under his breath. You were confident. I was arrogant. The general corrected with a grin. A few people laughed softly, easing the tension that had filled the room. But Sergeant Carter never embarrassed me for it. Instead, the general's smile slowly faded. There came a day when confidence wasn't enough. The restaurant became silent once more. Our convoy entered a narrow valley before sunrise. The intelligence report said the route was secure. It wasn't. No one interrupted him. We drove straight into a carefully planned ambush. Jason unconsciously leaned forward. Emily forgot the tray she was still holding. General Anderson continued, his voice calm but unmistakably emotional. Within seconds, smoke covered the road. The first vehicle was disabled. Communications failed. I couldn't even hear my own orders. His eyes drifted toward Elijah. I was 26 years old. I honestly believed those were the last moments of my life. The room remained perfectly still. I froze. The admission surprised everyone. Every officer is taught to make decisions under pressure. But fear doesn't always follow training. He paused. Mine certainly didn't. General Anderson looked directly at Elijah before continuing. While I was trying to understand what was happening, Sergeant Carter had already made his decision. Elijah lowered his eyes, as though he wished the story belonged to someone else. He ignored incoming fire. He moved from vehicle to vehicle. He pulled wounded soldiers to safety. He reorganized our defense. And before anyone else realized it, the general said quietly, he had taken command. Michael swallowed hard. Every Marine in the room understood exactly what those words meant. Not because rank had changed, but because leadership had revealed itself. General Anderson smiled gently. He never shouted. He never panicked. He simply kept telling us one sentence. The general looked at Elijah. Do you remember? Elijah hesitated before answering. I told him to keep moving. The general nodded. No, you told us. He paused, allowing every person in the restaurant to hear the words clearly. As long as we're breathing, nobody gets left behind. Silence returned. The sentence seemed to settle over the room like a weight. General Anderson drew a slow breath. Those words carried frightened young soldiers through one of the worst days of our deployment. He glanced at Elijah with unmistakable admiration. Many of us came home because one man refused to leave anyone behind. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. There were others. There always are. General Anderson smiled again. That's exactly what makes him who he is. He has spent 3 decades giving credit to everyone except himself. The general looked around the dining room one final time. So when I walked through that door today and saw this American hero sitting alone, his voice grew quieter. I wasn't about to let that remain the story anyone remembered. Character is revealed long before recognition arrives. Recognition simply gives everyone else a chance to catch up. No one spoke after General Anderson finished. The words lingered over every table like a quiet confession. For the first time that afternoon, people were no longer looking at Elijah Carter's worn jacket or faded veteran's cap. They were looking at the man inside them. Emily slowly walked back toward his table. She looked at the untouched menu still lying beside his coffee cup and suddenly remembered how apologetic she had felt when she seated him alone. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter, she said softly. Elijah looked up, surprised. For what? She glanced around the dining room. I saw what happened. So did you. Her voice trembled. I should have done more. Elijah smiled with the same quiet kindness she had noticed the moment he entered. You treated me with respect. That's more than enough. Emily blinked back tears. He wasn't protecting his own pride. He was protecting hers. Across the room, Jason Miller remained standing beside his table, unable to escape the uncomfortable weight settling over him. Only 20 minutes earlier, he had quietly moved away from Elijah without saying a word. He had convinced himself it wasn't personal. Now every excuse sounded hollow. Slowly, he walked toward the elderly veteran. I owe you an apology. Elijah looked at him calmly. Jason took a slow breath. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed things I shouldn't have. I can't change what I did. But I'm sorry. The restaurant waited for Elijah's response. He could have embarrassed the man. He could have reminded everyone what had happened. Instead, Elijah simply extended his hand. Then let's not waste today carrying yesterday. Jason accepted the handshake, his eyes lowering with genuine humility. General Anderson watched quietly. A small smile crossed his face. Some victories never appear in military history books, yet they matter just as much. Nearby, Michael Turner approached the table and came to attention. Master Sergeant Carter. Elijah turned toward the young Marine. Sir, would you do me the honor of letting me buy your lunch? Elijah laughed softly. I think the military already bought enough meals for me. Michael smiled. Then let me thank you another way. Without waiting for permission, he gently picked up Elijah's food tray and carried it to a larger table near the center of the restaurant. Several customers immediately stood. An elderly couple offered their seats. Another veteran quietly moved his belongings aside. Within seconds, the table that had once been empty was surrounded by people asking a simple question. Would you mind if we joined you? Elijah looked around, almost overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He glanced at General Anderson. The general answered with only a small nod. This time, Elijah accepted. Please. Chairs scraped gently across the wooden floor as strangers became companions. Conversations began again. Not about politics. Not about medals. Not about rank. They asked Elijah where he grew up. They asked about his family. They laughed at stories from his years in uniform. For the first time that afternoon, no one noticed the color of the man sitting at the center of the table. They noticed only his warmth, his humility, and the quiet strength that had never asked to be seen. General Anderson looked around the restaurant and thought to himself that respect had finally found the man who had carried it within himself all along. The strongest legacy is not written in medals. It lives quietly inside the people who choose to become better because they met you. Lunch had long since arrived, but very few people seemed interested in eating. Instead, they listened. Every story Elijah shared carried the same quiet humility. When someone thanked him for his service, he thanked them for remembering. When another customer called him a hero, he gently shook his head. I was never alone. It was always his first answer. General Anderson smiled knowingly. That's exactly what he used to say 30 years ago. The table laughed softly. Emily refilled coffee cups as conversations flowed naturally around Elijah. She noticed something remarkable. People weren't interrupting him. They were leaning in, listening, not because of his military record, because of the peace in his voice. An elderly woman sitting nearby finally asked the question everyone else had been wondering. Mr. Carter, after everything you've been through, she hesitated. How do you still trust people? The table fell silent. It was a difficult question, perhaps the most difficult one of the afternoon. Elijah looked into his coffee for a moment before answering. If I stopped trusting people because of a few bad moments. He smiled gently. Then the people who taught me kindness would lose too. No one spoke. He continued quietly. I've met cruel people. I've met generous people. I've served beside every race, every background, every faith. The uniform never erased our differences, but it reminded us that character mattered more than any of them. Michael lowered his eyes. Jason slowly nodded. Even General Anderson seemed moved by words he had never heard before. Elijah leaned back slightly. You could spend your life proving someone wrong. Or, he paused. You could spend your life proving your values right. The sentence settled over the table with quiet power. Emily realized she would remember it for the rest of her life. Across the restaurant, a teenage boy who had been eating with his parents quietly stood and walked toward Elijah. He could not have been older than 16. His baseball cap rested nervously in his hands. Sir, Elijah looked up. Yes, my grandfather served in the army. He passed away last year. The boy swallowed hard. I never asked him enough questions. His voice cracked slightly. I wish I had. Elijah reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. Then honor him by listening to someone else's story. The boy smiled through watery eyes. I just did. General Anderson quietly reached into the inside pocket of his dress jacket. He removed a small velvet presentation box. No one at the table had noticed him carrying it. He placed the box carefully in front of Elijah. "I've been meaning to return this." Elijah frowned with quiet confusion. "What is it?" "You'll see." Slowly, Elijah opened the box. Inside rested a worn combat challenge coin. Its edges were scratched. Its engraving had faded with time. For several long seconds, Elijah simply stared at it. His fingers trembled. General Anderson spoke softly. "You gave it to me the morning after the ambush. You told me that real leaders don't carry reminders of victory. They carry reminders of responsibility." Elijah closed the box carefully. His eyes glistened. "I never expected to see it again." The general smiled. "I borrowed it." He paused. "I think it's finally time I gave it back to the man who earned it. Recognition is powerful, but the greatest reward is discovering that your example continues long after you believe your work was finished." Elijah held the challenge coin in the palm of his hand. Its weathered surface reflected the afternoon light spilling through the restaurant windows. He slowly ran his thumb across the faded insignia. "So many years," he whispered. General Anderson nodded. "I carried it on every deployment." The room became still again. "There were nights," the general continued, "when difficult decisions rested entirely on my shoulders." He looked down at the coin. "Whenever I doubted myself, I reached into my pocket. I would feel this coin, and I would remember what you taught me." Elijah looked up, surprised. "I never taught strategy." The general smiled. "No, you taught responsibility. You taught that leadership begins the moment someone else's life becomes more important than your own." Michael Turner listened carefully, committing every word to memory. Around the table, several veterans quietly nodded in agreement. They understood. Those lessons could never be found in manuals, only in people. General Anderson gently pushed the velvet box closer. "I've received decorations from presidents. I've stood beside world leaders. I've commanded thousands of soldiers." He paused. "But none of those moments shaped me as much as serving under you." Elijah lowered his head slightly, uncomfortable with praise. "You've done far greater things than I ever did." The general shook his head immediately. "No, I simply had a larger stage. You gave me the principles that allowed me to stand on it." Silence followed. Not an awkward silence, a grateful one. Emily noticed several customers quietly wiping tears from their eyes. Even Jason no longer looked embarrassed. He looked inspired. Across the restaurant, the teenage boy who had spoken earlier approached once more. "General?" Anderson turned. "Yes, son. If I join the military someday." He hesitated. "How do I become someone like Mr. Carter?" The question drew gentle smiles around the room. General Anderson glanced toward Elijah before answering. "You don't begin by trying to become someone famous. You begin by noticing the person beside you. If they struggle, help them. If they fall, lift them. If they succeed, celebrate them." He rested one hand lightly on Elijah's shoulder. "That's exactly what this man spent an entire career doing." The teenager looked at Elijah. "Is that really all there is to it?" Elijah chuckled softly. "It's enough to keep a person busy for a lifetime." Laughter rippled through the restaurant. Warm, honest, healing. Linda Cooper quietly walked to the front entrance and flipped the small sign hanging in the window. Instead of "open," she turned it to "temporarily closed." One customer noticed. "Weren't you expecting the lunch rush?" Linda smiled. "It can wait." She looked around the dining room. Some afternoons are worth more than business. No one argued. For another hour, strangers remained seated together. Stories replaced assumptions. Respect replaced distance. And every person in Carter's Grill realized they had witnessed something far greater than a military reunion. They had watched a lifetime of quiet integrity return home through the gratitude of a man who had never forgotten the soldier who taught him that true leadership is measured not by the rank on your shoulders, but by the lives that stand taller because you walked beside them. A single moment of respect can end inside a room. A story of respect can travel farther than anyone who witnessed it. As the afternoon drew to a close, people slowly began leaving Carter's Grill. But no one walked out unchanged. Several customers paused before reaching the door. Some shook Elijah's hand. Others simply thanked him. A few veterans saluted quietly before stepping outside. The restaurant that had once surrounded him with empty chairs now struggled to say goodbye. Emily watched through the front window as General Anderson and Elijah stood together beneath the warm afternoon sun. They spoke privately for a few moments before embracing like old friends reunited after far too many years. Neither man noticed Sarah Collins. She had arrived nearly an hour earlier. The local television reporter had originally stopped by to cover the general's unexpected visit to the town. Instead, she had witnessed something entirely different. She lowered the camera she had been holding. For once, she realized that no dramatic narration was necessary. The truth spoke for itself. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in the newsroom. Her editor looked over her shoulder. "So," he pointed toward the footage. "What's the headline?" Sarah thought for a moment. "It isn't about a 4-star general." "No." She shook her head. "It's about the man he refused to let the world forget." The editor smiled. "Now that's a story." Within hours, the video appeared online. At first, only a few. 100 people watched, then a few thousand. By midnight, the number climbed into the hundreds of thousands. People weren't sharing it because of military ceremony. They were sharing it because they recognized something rare. Humility, honor, gratitude. Comments began appearing from every corner of the country. "I served with men like Mr. Carter. My father never spoke about his service either. This reminded me to call my grandfather. We should never wait until it's too late to thank our heroes." By sunrise, millions had watched the short video. National news outlets requested interviews. Veterans organizations shared the story. Military academies replayed General Anderson's words during leadership discussions. But the moment people returned to most often lasted less than 10 seconds. The salute. Not because it was perfect, because it was sincere. Jason Miller watched the video alone from his office. He replayed the beginning several times. There he was, quietly moving away from Elijah's table. He closed his eyes. That single decision now reminded him how easily assumptions become actions. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone. He called the manager of Carter's Grill. "I'd like to do something." Linda answered. "What did you have in mind?" Jason took a deep breath. "I want to create a standing fund, so any veteran who walks through your doors can enjoy a meal without asking if someone is paid." Linda smiled. "I think Mr. Carter would like that." Across town, Michael Turner watched the same video before leaving for his evening training. He slipped a small notebook into his backpack. On the first page, he wrote only one sentence. "As long as we're breathing, nobody gets left behind." He closed the notebook carefully. Some lessons belonged in classrooms. Others belonged in history. But the most important ones were carried quietly from one generation to the next, waiting for someone willing to live them. Long after applause fades, character continues speaking, and sometimes the quietest life becomes the loudest lesson. Several weeks passed. The crowds eventually disappeared. Television cameras moved on to newer stories. Headlines changed. The internet found something else to celebrate. But some stories were never meant to live only on a screen. They were meant to live inside people. On a cool Saturday morning, Carter's Grill opened its doors as usual. Emily smiled as the first customers walked inside. Something had changed. Near the entrance stood a simple wooden plaque. No flashing lights. No grand ceremony. Only a few carefully engraved words. In honor of those who served with quiet courage. No veteran eats alone. Beneath the inscription rested a single empty chair. Not because someone was missing, but as a reminder that no one should ever feel forgotten again. Linda gently brushed a hand across the plaque before beginning another day. "It belongs here," she whispered. By lunchtime, Elijah Carter walked through the front door once more. He wore the same faded cap, the same worn jacket, the same calm smile. Only this time, the room reacted differently. Before Emily could even greet him, an elderly couple stood and waved. Mr. Carter, a family invited him to join their table. Michael, now visiting whenever his training schedule allowed, rose to shake his hand. Jason was already seated near the window. He smiled warmly. "Your seat is waiting." Elijah looked around the restaurant. Weeks earlier, every empty chair had reminded him of loneliness. Now every occupied chair seemed to offer friendship. He laughed quietly. "I suppose I don't have much choice anymore." The room answered with gentle laughter. He took his seat, not at the center, simply among everyone else, exactly where he had always wanted to be. As lunch continued, the teenage boy returned carrying a small envelope. "I thought you should have this." Elijah opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. It showed the entire restaurant gathered around one table. Veterans, families, servers, a general, a businessman, a young Marine, complete strangers smiling together. Written across the bottom, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Because of you, no one sits alone." Elijah stared at the photograph for several long moments. His eyes filled with quiet tears. Not tears of sadness, not even pride, only gratitude. General Anderson's words returned to him. "You never realized how many people were watching." Perhaps that had always been true. The greatest examples are often given without an audience. Outside, the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, filling the restaurant with a gentle warmth. Life continued. Meals were served. Coffee was poured. Conversations rose and felt like familiar music. Yet something invisible had changed forever. Not because a four-star general had offered a salute, not because millions had watched a video, but because ordinary people had chosen to see one another differently. Sometimes justice does not arrive with a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it begins when one person refuses to overlook another. And sometimes the most powerful salute is not the one offered between soldiers. It is the quiet decision to recognize the dignity that has always existed in another human being. Because medals grow old, uniforms are eventually folded away. Even memories fade with time. But kindness remembered becomes legacy. And from that day forward, in one small restaurant, no veteran and no human being who walked through those doors ever had to sit alone again.